The morning mist clung to the valley like guilt to a sinner's conscience, and Lula Perry knew something about both. She bent low over the potato rows, her calloused hands working the rich soil with practiced efficiency, while the sun climbed higher over Samuel Garrett's sprawling homestead. The earth here was good, black and fertile, nothing like the rocky hardscrabble plots she'd worked further south where decent folk wouldn't hire the likes of her. Here, for 3 blessed months, she'd been just another pair of hands willing to work dawn to dusk for meals and a dry place to sleep in the barn loft. Lula. Samuel's voice carried across the field, warm and steady as it had been since the day he'd found her half-starved at his gate. "Come help me with this harness, would you?" She straightened, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, and walked toward where he stood beside his draft horse, Goliath. Samuel Garrett was a good man, she'd learned in these months of working his land. A widower in his early 40s with gentle hands and kind eyes, the sort of man who said grace over every meal and meant it. The sort who took in strays without asking too many questions, though she'd caught him watching her sometimes with a puzzled expression, as if trying to place where he might have seen her face before. "This buckle's giving me trouble," he said, holding up the leather strap. "Your fingers are nimbler than mine." Lula took the harness, her touch sure and quick. She'd learned to be useful, indispensable even because useful people got to stay. People who earned their keep didn't get asked uncomfortable questions about their past or why they flinched when strangers rode up the lane. "There," she said, handing it back. "Should hold fine now. Thank you kindly." Samuel's smile was genuine, reaching his eyes in a way that still surprised her. "You've got a gift with leather work. My Sarah used to say the same about fixing what was broken." He mentioned his late wife sometimes, always with that gentle reverence that spoke of true love. Lula had seen the small headstone in the family plot beyond the apple orchard, had read the inscription during one of her evening walks. Sarah Elizabeth Garrett, beloved wife, gone too soon. She'd wondered what it would be like to be mourned that way, to be remembered with such tenderness. "I had good teaching," Lula said simply because she had. Her father, for all his sins, had taught her to work with her hands, to fix what was broken, to make do with what she had. It was perhaps the only honest gift he'd ever given her. "Well, you've been a blessing to this place," Samuel said, adjusting the harness on Goliath's broad back. "I don't know how I managed before you came along." The words warmed her more than they should have. She'd learned not to get attached, not to let herself believe in kindness that might disappear as soon as the truth came out. But Samuel Garrett made it hard to keep her walls up. He said morning prayers that included thanks for her help, left extra biscuits on her plate when he thought she wasn't looking, and treated her with a respect she'd never known she was missing until she had it. "Storm coming in," she observed, nodding toward the dark clouds gathering over the western mountains. "Should get the wheat under cover." Samuel followed her gaze, squinting at the sky. "Good eye. Let's get the boys to help us." The boys were Tommy and Jake Morrison, brothers who worked Samuel's land during harvest season. Good men, both of them, though Tommy had a tendency to drink too much on Saturday nights and Jake told stories that stretched the truth until it snapped. They were honest work, though, and they treated her with the same casual respect they showed Samuel, which was more than she'd found most places. They worked through the afternoon, racing the storm clouds that rolled across the sky like God's own cavalry. Lula lost herself in the familiar rhythm of physical labor, the satisfaction of work well done, the simple pleasure of earning her keep through honest sweat. This was what she'd dreamed of during those long years when her father's reputation followed her like a shadow, the chance to be judged by her work rather than her blood. The rain started just as they finished loading the last wagon, fat droplets that promised a proper soaking. Samuel sent the Morrison boys home to their families and helped Lula secure the barn doors against the coming storm. Might be wise to stay in the house tonight, he said, glancing at the loft where she'd made her quarters. That roof's got a leak or two and this looks to be a fierce one. Lula shook her head. I'll be fine. Done worse than a little water. But Samuel was already moving toward the house, and his tone brooked no argument. Sarah would haunt me proper if I let a lady sleep in a leaking barn during a storm. There's a spare room off the kitchen. Clean sheets and everything. The word lady made her chest tighten. When was the last time someone had called her that and meant it? She wanted to protest, to maintain the careful distance she'd cultivated, but the storm was building in earnest now, and she was tired of always being cold and wet. Just for tonight, she said. Samuel's house was everything her childhood home hadn't been. Clean and warm, with quilts on the furniture and photographs on the mantelpiece. Evidence of a life lived with love and care, of seasons celebrated and sorrows shared. She stood awkwardly in the kitchen while Samuel bustled about, lighting lamps and stoking the fire. Sit, he said, pulling out a chair at the wooden table. I'll fix us some supper. I can help. You've done enough today. Rest. She sat because he asked her to, because the kindness in his voice made her weak in ways she couldn't afford to be. She watched him move around his kitchen with easy familiarity, pulling ingredients from cupboards, setting a pot of coffee on the stove. This was what normal looked like, she realized. This quiet domestic rhythm, this assumption of safety and belonging. Tell me about yourself, Lula, Samuel said as he worked. I know you're from down south somewhere, but that's about all. Got any family? The question she'd been dreading, asked with such gentle curiosity that it hurt to deflect it. Not anymore. I'm sorry. Lost my folks young too. Makes a person grow up fast. She nodded, letting him think what he would. It was easier than explaining that she'd lost her father to a hangman's rope 5 years ago, that she'd been running from his shadow ever since, that every kind gesture she'd received in those years had turned to disgust the moment people learned who she was. Thunder rolled across the valley, rattling the windows, and Samuel set a bowl of stew in front of her. It smelled like home should smell, rich and nourishing, seasoned with care rather than desperation. Samuel, she began, then stopped. She wanted to tell him, wanted to trust him with the truth that had driven her from town to town, job to job, always moving before anyone could connect her face with her father's wanted posters. But the words stuck in her throat, heavy as lead. What is it? She looked into his kind eyes and saw her own reflection there, saw how he saw her, as Lula, the woman who'd worked his fields with dedication, who'd fixed his harnesses and helped him through the harvest. Not as John Perry's daughter, not as the child of a killer and a thief. Just as herself. Nothing, she said. Just, thank you. For the work, for taking me in. I know you didn't have to. Course I did. We take care of our own out here. Our own. The words settled into her chest like a warm stone. When was the last time she'd been anyone's own? They ate in comfortable silence while the storm raged outside, and Lula allowed herself to imagine just for a moment what it would be like to stay. To belong somewhere, to be part of something good and clean and honest. To have a man look at her the way Samuel had looked at his wife's photograph, with love and respect and the assumption that she was worth loving. But she knew better than to let dreams take root. They always ended the same way, with discovery and disgust and the long road stretching out ahead of her again. The knock came just after 8 o'clock, sharp and insistent above the thunder. Samuel frowned, setting down his coffee cup. Who'd be out in weather like this? Lula's blood turned to ice water. She knew that kind of knock, urgent and official. The kind that meant trouble had found her again. Don't answer it, she whispered, but Samuel was already moving toward the door. Might be someone needing help. Morrison boys maybe, or... The door opened to reveal Deputy Marshal Frank Butler, rain streaming from his hat brim, his coat black with water. Behind him stood two other men Lula didn't recognize, but their badges caught the lamplight, and their hands rested easy on their guns. "Evening, Samuel," Butler said, stepping inside without invitation. His eyes swept the room and landed on Lula with satisfaction. "Heard you might have a visitor we're interested in talking to." Samuel looked between Butler and Lula, confusion clear on his face. "What's this about, Frank?" Butler pulled a folded paper from his coat, the edges worn from handling. Lula knew what it was before he unfolded it, had seen it too many times in too many towns. Her father's face stared out from the yellowed wanted poster, and beneath it, in smaller print, the words that had haunted her for years, also wanted for questioning. Daughter Lula Perry, approximately 22 years of age, believed to have knowledge of stolen gold from the Canyon Creek robbery. "This here's Lula Perry," Butler said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a hunter who'd finally cornered his prey. "John Perry's girl. Been looking for her for months." The silence that followed was deafening. Lula watched Samuel's face change as the truth sank in, watched the kindness drain out of his eyes to be replaced by something else. Shock maybe. Disappointment certainly. The same look she'd seen on every face when her secret came out. "That true?" Samuel asked quietly. "You John Perry's daughter?" She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze despite the shame burning in her chest. "Yes." "The John Perry who killed 3 men in Canyon Creek? Who robbed banks from here to Colorado?" "Yes." Samuel stepped back as if she'd struck him, and the movement cut deeper than any harsh word could have. This was why she didn't get attached, why she didn't let herself hope. Because this moment always came, when people learned who she was and decided she was guilty by blood alone. "Now, Miss Perry," Butler said, moving closer, "we got some questions for you about your daddy's last job. Seems there was a considerable sum of money never accounted for, and folks figure you might know where he hid it." "I don't know anything about any gold," Lula said, the words automatic after years of repetition. "Haven't seen him since I was 17. That's what they all say. But you been moving around awful regular for someone with nothing to hide. Different name in every town, always moving on just when folks start asking questions." One of the other marshals stepped forward, iron shackles gleaming in his hands. "Lula Perry, you're under arrest for questioning in connection with the Canyon Creek robbery. You have the right to." "Now hold on just a minute." Everyone turned to stare at Samuel, who'd moved to stand between Lula and the marshals. His voice was quiet but carried a note of steel that Lula had never heard before. "Hold on for what?" Butler demanded. "This is official business, Samuel. Don't go making this harder than it needs to be. What's this woman done? I mean specifically, what crime has she committed?" Butler's eyes narrowed. "She's wanted for questioning in connection with." "That's not a crime, Frank. Being related to an outlaw ain't a crime, and wanting to question someone ain't the same as charging them with something. She's been evading questioning for 5 years. That's obstruction. Has she now? Or has she just been trying to live her life without being harassed for her father's sins?" Samuel's voice grew stronger, more certain. "This woman has worked my land for 3 months. Honest work, good work. Never gave me a moment's trouble, never took so much as an apple that wasn't offered. If she knew where some lost gold was hidden, you think she'd be breaking her back in potato fields for room and board?" Lula stared at him in amazement. He was defending her. Even knowing who she was, what she carried, he was standing between her and the law. "Samuel," she said quietly, "don't. They're right to question me. I am John Perry's daughter." He turned to look at her, and she saw something in his eyes she'd never expected to see again. Not pity or disgust, but understanding. "That what you choose to be?" "What?" Did you choose to be John Perry's daughter? Or did you just happen to be born to him? The question hit her like a physical blow. No one had ever asked her that before. They'd all assumed that blood was destiny, that carrying an outlaw's name meant carrying his guilt. I didn't choose it, she whispered. Then you got nothing to be ashamed of. Samuel turned back to the marshals, his stance firm. And you got no right to arrest her for being born to the wrong man. Butler's face darkened. You harboring a fugitive, Samuel? Because that's a crime with real consequences. I'm harboring a woman who's done honest work and given me no cause for complaint. If you want to question her, you can do it here in my house with me present. But you're not dragging her off in shackles like some common criminal. The three lawmen exchanged glances, clearly not expecting this kind of resistance from a respectable rancher. Lula felt something crack open in her chest, some frozen place beginning to thaw. He was still defending her, still standing firm even though he knew the truth now. Fine, Butler said finally. We'll ask our questions here. But this don't change nothing, Samuel. She's still John Perry's daughter, and that means she's trouble. Maybe, Samuel said, never taking his eyes off the deputy marshal. But she's also a woman who's worked hard and honest on my land, and that ought to count for something. He pulled out a chair for her, his movements deliberate and protective. Sit, Lula. Answer their questions true, and let's get this done. She sat, her hands shaking slightly as she folded them in her lap. Samuel took the chair beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence, solid and reassuring. Now then, Butler said, consulting a small notebook. When did you last see your father? The day he was arrested. I was 17. That'd be 5 years ago. Where have you been since then? Working. Different places, different jobs. I don't stay anywhere long. Why's that? Lula glanced at Samuel, drawing strength from his steady presence. Because people don't much like hiring John Perry's daughter once they find out who I am. You ever help your father with any of his activities? No. He kept me away from all that. Said it wasn't fitting for a woman. But you knew what he did for a living. She'd always been honest about this part because lying about it felt like betraying the few good memories she had of him. I knew he was an outlaw. But he told me he was Robin Hood, taking from rich men who'd gotten their money dishonest. I was a child. I believed what he told me. When did you stop believing? The question caught her off guard. She thought of the night she'd learned the truth, when she'd found the newspaper clipping hidden in his saddlebags. The story of the Canyon Creek robbery, the 3 men who died, the family left destitute. Her hero father revealed as nothing more than a killer and a thief. When I was 16, I found evidence. Realized he wasn't the man I thought he was. What kind of evidence? Samuel cleared his throat. Seems to me that's getting pretty personal, Frank. What's this got to do with missing gold? Butler shot him an irritated look but pressed on. After your father was arrested, did anyone come looking for you? Any of his associates? A few times. They thought I might know where he'd hidden things. I told them the same thing I'm telling you. I don't know anything about any gold. Yet you've been running ever since. Innocent people don't usually run. Samuel's hand moved slightly on the table, not quite touching hers but close enough to offer comfort. Innocent people run from persecution all the time, Frank. You ought to know that. The questioning went on for another hour, covering the same ground over and over. Lula answered everything truthfully, her voice growing steadier as Samuel's presence anchored her. When they asked about the last time she'd spoken to her father, she told them about the visit to the jail, how he'd begged her to forgive him, how she'd walked away without a word and never looked back. Finally, Butler closed his notebook with a sharp snap. Well, Miss Perry, seems like either you're telling the truth or you're a better liar than your daddy was. She's telling the truth, Samuel said firmly. Anyone who's watched her work, who's seen how she carries herself, would know that. Butler stood, his companions following suit. Maybe so. But that don't change the fact that trouble follows the Perry name. Might want to keep that in mind, Samuel. The threat was clear and Lula felt her heart sink. This was how it always ended, with warnings and whispers, with decent people deciding she wasn't worth the risk. I'll keep that in mind, Samuel said, but his tone suggested he wasn't much concerned with Butler's warnings. After the marshals left, the house fell silent except for the rain against the windows and the crackle of the fire. Lula sat frozen in her chair, waiting for Samuel to tell her to pack her things, to be gone by morning. It would be kinder than most had been, but it would still hurt. Instead, he got up and poured 2 cups of coffee, setting one in front of her before retaking his seat. "Drink," he said gently. "You look ready to fall over." She wrapped her hands around the warm cup, using it to steady herself. "I should go. Tonight before word spreads. You don't want to be associated with John Perry's daughter. Why don't you let me decide what I want?" The quiet words made her look up at him, searching his face for signs of the disgust or fear she'd learned to expect. Instead, she found the same kindness that had been there before, perhaps tempered with new understanding but not diminished. "You heard what Butler said. I'm trouble. I always have been." "You've been trouble to me these past 3 months? That's different. You didn't know. I know you work harder than any 2 men I've hired. I know you've got gentle hands with hurt animals and you say grace before every meal without being asked. I know you mended my shirts without being told and you've never taken more than you've earned." He leaned forward, his eyes serious. "That's what I know about you, Lula. Not what some wanted poster says, not what your father did or didn't do. What you've shown me with your own hands and your own heart." The words hit her like a revelation. She'd spent so many years seeing herself through other people's disgust that she'd forgotten there might be another way to be seen. "You don't understand," she whispered. "People will talk. They'll say you're harboring a criminal, that you can't be trusted. It'll hurt your reputation, your business. Let them talk." Samuel's voice was firm. "I've got nothing to be ashamed of, and neither do you. But I am John Perry's daughter." "Yes, you are. And from what I can see, that means you know what it's like to be judged unfairly, to have to work twice as hard to prove yourself. Means you understand the value of honest work and honest people." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, warm and calloused and steady. "Seems to me that makes you exactly the kind of person I want on my land." Lula stared down at their joined hands, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "You want me to stay?" "I want you to stay. Not as hired help sleeping in the barn, but as, well, as whatever you want to be. This is a big house for one person and I could use the company. Sarah always said this place was meant for a family." The offer hung between them, full of possibility and danger in equal measure. Lula thought of all the times she'd dreamed of belonging somewhere, of having someone look at her the way Samuel was looking at her now. Not as John Perry's daughter, but as herself. As Lula, who worked hard and said her prayers and mended shirts without being asked. "The whole territory will know by morning," she said. "Butler won't keep quiet about this. Then we'll face it together. Together." The word sent warmth spreading through her chest like whiskey on a cold night. When was the last time she'd been part of it together? "I don't know anything about the gold," she said, needing him to understand. "I've told the truth about that. But there are things about my father, about what it was like growing up with him. I'm not sure I'm ready to talk about all of it." "Then we won't talk about it until you are." Samuel squeezed her hand gently. "We've got time, Lula. All the time you need." Outside, the storm was beginning to pass, the thunder growing more distant. But inside Samuel Garrett's warm kitchen, with his hand covering hers and his kind eyes reflecting the firelight, Lula Perry felt something she'd never felt before. She felt safe. She felt seen. She felt like maybe, just maybe, she'd finally found a place where she could stop running. "All right," she whispered. "I'll stay." Samuel smiled, and it was like sunrise after the longest night of her life. "Good. That's real good." As if to seal the promise, he stood and walked to a wooden chest in the corner of the room. From it, he pulled out a quilt, beautifully made with intricate stitching, and brought it back to her. "Sarah made this," he said, settling it around her shoulders. "She always said a person ought to have something beautiful to wrap around them when the world gets cold." Lula pulled the quilt closer, feeling the love stitched into every seam. For the first time in 5 years, she wasn't just John Perry's daughter anymore. She was Lula, sitting in Samuel Garrett's kitchen, wrapped in his late wife's quilt, with the promise of tomorrow stretching out ahead of her like a well-tended field ready for planting. The storm might have passed, but Lula knew there would be others. Word would spread about who she was, and there would be whispers and pointed fingers and maybe worse. But for tonight she was safe. For tonight she was home. And tomorrow she would wake up in a place where someone had chosen to see her worth despite her father's sins, where someone had decided she was worth fighting for. It was more than she'd ever dared to hope for, and it was enough to build a new life on. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and outside, the first stars were beginning to show through the breaking clouds. Lula Perry closed her eyes and let herself believe, for the first time in years, that she might finally be free. Summer settled over the valley like a benediction, bringing with it the kind of heat that made work a prayer and sweat a sacrament. Lula had moved from the spare room to the main part of the house by June, taking over the domestic duties that had been neglected since Sarah's passing. She found herself humming while she worked, a sound that surprised her each time it escaped her lips. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt light enough for music. The kitchen had become her domain, and she took fierce pride in the meals she set before Samuel each evening. Pot roast on Sundays, fresh bread every other day, vegetables from the garden she'd coaxed back to life behind the house. Samuel ate with the appreciation of a man who'd been making do with his own poor cooking for too long, and his grateful comments warmed her more than she cared to admit. "This cornbread's near as good as Sarah's," he said one evening in late June, reaching for a second piece. She'd be pleased to know her kitchen was in such capable hands. Lula felt heat rise in her cheeks at the comparison. She'd found Sarah's recipe book tucked away in a drawer, pages worn soft from use, margins filled with notes in a careful feminine hand. Following those recipes felt like learning about the woman who'd lived here before her, understanding the care she'd put into feeding her husband, the love she'd poured into their daily bread. "Found her garden notes too," Lula said, serving him another helping of green beans. She knew this soil better than most folks know their own names. Gardens producing more than it has in years, according to the Morrison boys. Samuel nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Sarah always said the land would provide if you listened to what it needed. Seems like you've got the same gift." The word gift sat strangely with Lula. She'd never thought of her abilities as gifts, merely as skills learned from necessity. But under Samuel's gentle encouragement, she'd begun to see herself differently. Not as John Perry's daughter trying to outrun her shame, but as a woman with her own talents, her own worth. The change hadn't gone unnoticed by others in the valley. When Samuel took her to town for supplies, she felt the weight of stares and whispers following them down the dusty main street. Deputy Marshal Butler had kept his word about spreading the news of her identity, and the reaction had been swift and predictable. "That's her," she'd heard Mrs. Henderson whisper to her companion outside the general store. "John Perry's girl. Bold as brass, walking around like she belongs here." Heard she's moved right into Samuel Garrett's house, came the scandalized reply. Poor Sarah ain't been gone but 2 years and he's taken up with an outlaw's daughter. Samuel had heard too, she was certain, but he never acknowledged the whispers, never suggested that perhaps she should stay home when he went to town. Instead, he walked beside her with his head high, greeting neighbors with the same courteous nod he'd always given, treating her with the same respectful attention he'd show any lady. It was at the church social in early July that the tension finally boiled over. Lula had been reluctant to attend, knowing her presence would cause talk, but Samuel had insisted. "Can't let fear make our decisions for us," he'd said, adjusting his tie in the mirror by the front door. "Besides, Reverend Matthews has been asking after you. Says he'd like to meet the woman who's brought such life back to my place." The social was held in the churchyard under strings of lanterns, tables laden with dishes brought by the women of the congregation. Lula had contributed an apple pie made from Sarah's recipe, and she watched nervously as people sampled it, wondering if they'd taste her shame along with the apples. Reverend Matthews proved to be a kind man in his 60s, with gentle eyes and a firm handshake. "Miss Perry," he said warmly, "Samuel's told me wonderful things about your work on his homestead. It's clear the Lord has blessed you with many talents." "Thank you, Reverend," Lula replied, surprised by his acceptance. "It's been a blessing to have meaningful work. Hard work is its own form of worship," he said with a smile. "The Apostle Paul wrote that we ought to work with our hands, that we might have something to give to those in need. Seems to me you understand that principle well." His words wrapped around her like a warm shawl, offering a different way to see her circumstances. Not as penance for her father's sins, but as honest labor worthy of respect. But not everyone shared the Reverend's charitable view. As the evening progressed, Lula became aware of a cluster of women watching her with obvious disapproval. Their leader was Martha Hendricks, the banker's wife, a woman who'd appointed herself the keeper of the community's moral standards. "I don't care what Reverend Matthews says," Martha declared, her voice pitched to Carrie. "Blood will tell, and that girl's got outlaw blood running through her veins. Mark my words, she'll bring nothing but trouble to this valley." Her companion, Alice Morrison, a wife to one of Samuel's seasonal workers, nodded vigorously. "Already has, from what I hear. Frank Butler says there's been men asking questions about her, strangers passing through. We don't need that kind of attention." Lula felt her chest tighten, the familiar shame creeping up her throat like bile. This was how it always began? The whispers, the warnings, the gradual isolation that made staying impossible. She started to move toward the edge of the gathering, ready to slip away into the darkness, but Samuel appeared at her side. "Enjoying the social?" he asked, offering her a cup of lemonade. "People are talking," she said quietly. "People always talk. Question is whether we're going to let their talk decide how we live." Before she could respond, Martha Hendricks approached them, her face set in lines of righteous determination. "Samuel Garrett, I need to speak with you." "Evening, Martha. You remember Miss Perry?" Martha's gaze flicked over Lula with obvious distaste. "That's exactly what I want to discuss. Samuel, you're a respected man in this community, a pillar of the church. What do you think you're doing harboring that person in your home?" Samuel's expression didn't change, but Lula felt the subtle shift in his posture, the way he positioned himself slightly in front of her. "I'm providing honest work to someone who's proven herself worthy of it. Same as I'd do for anyone else. She's John Perry's daughter. That man was a killer and a thief, and she's a woman who's done nothing but work hard and mind her own business," Samuel interrupted, his voice carrying a note of steel. "What exactly is it you're accusing her of, Martha?" "I don't have to accuse her of anything specific. Her very presence here is a danger to decent folks. What happens when more of her father's associates come looking for her? What happens when whoever's been asking questions decides to make trouble for the whole valley? Lula felt the attention of the entire gathering focus on their conversation, saw neighbors edging closer to hear the confrontation. This was her worst nightmare made real, being the center of a public scene, having her shame laid bare for everyone to judge. "Then we'll deal with that if it happens," Samuel said calmly. "But I won't turn away someone who's proven herself decent and hardworking based on fears that might never come to pass. You're putting your own selfish desires ahead of the safety of this community," Martha snapped. "Everyone knows you've taken her into your house, into your bed most likely. Poor Sarah must be spinning in her grave." The accusation hung in the air like a slap, and Lula saw several of the men in the crowd shift uncomfortably. She opened her mouth to deny it, to explain that she slept in the spare room, that Samuel had been nothing but respectful, but Samuel spoke first. "Martha, you're talking about things you don't understand." His voice was quiet but carried clearly in the sudden silence. "Miss Perry has been a blessing to my household, and her reputation is spotless. If you've got complaints about how I conduct myself on my own property, you're welcome to take them up with me directly. But I won't have you slandering a lady in my presence." "Lady?" Martha's voice rose to a screech. "She's no lady, she's a woman under my protection," Samuel said firmly. "And I'd suggest you remember that." The crowd had gone completely silent now, everyone waiting to see how the confrontation would resolve. Lula felt trapped in the center of it all, wanting nothing more than to disappear, to spare Samuel the scene she'd brought to his doorstep. It was Reverend Matthews who broke the tension. "Perhaps," he said mildly, moving to stand beside Samuel, "we might remember our Lord's words about casting the first stone. I've had the pleasure of speaking with Miss Perry this evening, and I found her to be a thoughtful, God-fearing woman. Seems to me that's more important than who her father might have been." Several people in the crowd murmured agreement, and Lula felt a spark of hope. But Martha wasn't finished. "You can dress it up with pretty words all you like," she said, her face flushed with righteous anger. "But that doesn't change what she is. We all know why men take in women like her, and it's not for their skill with a garden hoe." The insult landed like a physical blow, and Lula felt tears spring to her eyes despite her efforts to remain composed. This was worse than she'd feared, worse than the simple rejection she was used to. Martha was impugning not just her character but Samuel's as well, dragging his name through the mud for the crime of showing her kindness. "That's enough." Samuel's voice cut through the murmurs like a blade. "Martha, you've just insulted both a lady and a gentleman, and you've done it in the house of God. I suggest you think carefully about whether that's the kind of person you want to be." Martha's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, clearly not expecting such direct confrontation. Around them, the crowd shifted uncomfortably, some nodding in agreement with Samuel, others looking uncertain. "The girl needs to go," Martha said finally, her voice shaking with emotion. "For the good of the community, she needs to go." "No." The word came from an unexpected source. Alice Morrison, the same woman who'd been nodding along with Martha's earlier complaints. She stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "No, I don't think she does." Everyone turned to stare at Alice, who'd rarely spoken up at community gatherings. She twisted her hands nervously but continued speaking. "My husband Jake works for Samuel," she said. "Comes home every day talking about how hard Miss Perry works, how she's helped get the place back to what it was when Mrs. Garrett was alive. Says she's respectful and kind, never puts on airs or acts like she's better than anyone else." Alice's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "Jake's worked for a lot of people over the years and he knows the difference between good folks and bad ones. He says Miss Perry's good people and I trust my husband's judgment. A murmur ran through the crowd and Lula saw several heads nodding in agreement. Tommy Morrison stepped forward to stand beside his sister-in-law. Alice is right, he said. Lula Perry works harder than most men I know, and she's never given anyone cause for complaint. What her father did has got nothing to do with who she is. More voices joined in, people who'd worked with her or encountered her around town speaking up in her defense. Not everyone. Martha still had her supporters and there were plenty who remained silent, but enough to shift the balance of opinion. This is ridiculous, Martha sputtered. You're all being taken in by a pretty face and a sad story. Mark my words, you'll regret this when trouble comes calling. Maybe trouble will come, said a new voice from the edge of the crowd. Everyone turned to see old Henry Blackwood, the valley's most respected elder, making his way forward with the help of his walking stick. But seems to me trouble comes whether we invite it or not. Question is whether we face it as a community or let fear divide us. Henry's words carried weight with everyone present. He'd been in the valley since before most of them were born, had seen droughts and floods, Indian troubles and outlaw raids, boom times and lean years. His opinion mattered. I knew John Perry, Henry continued, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. Knew him before he turned bad, when he was just a young man trying to make his way. He had good in him once, buried deep maybe, but it was there. Seems to me his daughter might have inherited that good instead of the bad. He looked directly at Lula, his weathered face kind. From what I've seen and heard, that's exactly what happened. The old man's endorsement seemed to settle something in the crowd. The tension that had been building all evening began to dissipate, replaced by a feeling of community solidarity that surprised Lula. She'd expected to be driven out, to be forced to move on once again. Instead, she found herself surrounded by people willing to give her a chance. Martha Hendricks, seeing the mood turning against her, gathered her skirts and stalked away, her closest supporters trailing behind her. But they were a small minority. Most of the gathering remained, and several people approached Lula to offer words of encouragement or simply to introduce themselves properly. Don't let Martha's words trouble you, said Rebecca Shaw, the doctor's wife. She's always been quick to judge and slow to forgive. Most of us aren't like that. Thank you, Lula managed, still overwhelmed by the unexpected support. As the evening wound down and people began to drift home, Samuel walked Lula back toward their wagon. The night air was soft and warm, filled with the sound of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. That was... Lula began, then stopped, not sure how to finish. Difficult, Samuel supplied. But necessary. Now everyone knows where things stand. I brought shame on you tonight. Martha was right about that much. Samuel stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. Lula, the only person who brought shame on anyone tonight was Martha Hendricks, and she brought it on herself. You conducted yourself with dignity and grace, even when she was attacking your character. But the things she said about us, about what people think is happening between us. What is happening between us? The question caught her off guard, partly because of its directness and partly because she wasn't sure she knew the answer. Over the past months, their relationship had deepened beyond employer and worker, beyond even friendship. She cared for him more than she'd allowed herself to care for anyone in years, and she thought, hoped, that he might feel the same way. I don't know, she said honestly. I know I care about you, about this place. I know I've never felt as safe or as valued as I do here. But I also know I'm John Perry's daughter, and that will always be true. I don't want to bring more trouble on you than I already have. Samuel reached out and took her hands in his, warm and calloused and steady. Lula, I need you to understand something. What happened tonight with Martha and the others? That wasn't about you bringing trouble. That was about people making a choice between fear and acceptance, between judgment and grace. Most of them chose grace. This time. But Martha was right about one thing. There have been men asking questions about me. What happens when they find me? Then we'll face it together. The same words he'd spoken that first night, but they carried more weight now, tested by time and public scrutiny. I meant what I said then and I mean it now. You're not alone anymore, Lula. The words settled into her heart like seeds finding fertile ground. She'd spent so many years believing that she would always be alone, that her father's legacy would forever separate her from decent people. But here was Samuel Garrett, respected by his community, offering her not just protection but partnership. "What are you saying?" she whispered. "I'm saying that I've come to care for you deeply. More than just as someone who works my land or keeps my house. I'm saying that when I think about the future, I can't imagine it without you in it." The declaration hung between them in the soft summer air, full of possibility and promise. Lula felt tears prick her eyes, but for once they weren't tears of shame or sorrow. "I care for you too," she said, her voice barely audible. "More than I thought I could care for anyone. But Samuel, I'm still John Perry's daughter. That's never going to change." "I know who you are," he said gently. "All of who you are. And I choose you anyway." He leaned down and kissed her then, soft and sweet under the stars, and Lula felt something break free in her chest. The last of the walls she'd built around her heart crumbled away, leaving her open and vulnerable and alive in ways she'd forgotten were possible. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his, breathing in the scent of him, honest sweat and leather and the soap she'd made herself from Sarah's recipe. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we go home," Samuel said, his voice rough with emotion. "And tomorrow we start building the life we want together." They climbed into the wagon and rode back to the homestead in comfortable silence, Lula's hand clasped in Samuel's as he guided the horses down the familiar road. The house came into view, solid and welcoming in the moonlight, and for the first time in her life, Lula felt like she was truly coming home. But as they approached the front gate, Samuel pulled the horses to a stop, his body suddenly tense. "That's not right," he murmured. Lula followed his gaze and saw what had caught his attention. The front door stood slightly ajar and there was no light showing in the windows. They'd left lamps burning when they departed for the social, as was customary when planning to return after dark. "Stay in the wagon," Samuel said quietly, reaching for the rifle he kept secured beneath the driver's seat. "No," Lula said, her hand covering his. "If someone's in there, they're likely looking for me. I won't let you face that alone." Samuel looked like he wanted to argue, but there wasn't time. A figure stepped out of the shadows beside the house, and even in the moonlight, Lula recognized the lean build and predatory stance of a man she'd hoped never to see again. "Evening, Lula girl," called a voice that haunted her nightmares. "Been looking for you for a long time." Marcus Kane stepped into the light, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. He'd been one of her father's associates, one of the men who'd come looking for her after John Perry's death. She'd managed to evade him for years, but her trail had finally gone cold here in the valley, and he'd found her at last. "What do you want, Marcus?" she called, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Same thing I always wanted, darling. That little conversation your daddy and I never got to finish before they stretched his neck. He told me some interesting things about gold, about where certain valuable items might be hidden. Figured his loving daughter might have some insights. I've told everyone who's asked, I don't know anything about any gold." Marcus laughed, a sound like gravel in a tin cup. "See, that's what everyone says at first. But I got ways of helping people remember things they thought they'd forgotten." Samuel shifted beside her, the rifle now fully in his hands. "Mister, I suggest you move along. You're trespassing on private property." "This doesn't concern you, farmer," Marcus said, his voice carrying a casual menace that made Lula's blood run cold. "This is family business." "She is my family," Samuel said firmly. "And that makes it my business." Marcus tilted his head, studying Samuel with predatory interest. "That so? Well then, family man, maybe you can help convince little Lula here to be more cooperative. See, I got reason to believe her daddy hid something valuable before his last job went bad. Something worth killing for." The threat was unmistakable, and Lula felt the familiar ice of fear settle in her stomach. But this time it wasn't just fear for herself. Samuel was in danger because of her, because he'd chosen to protect her. "Marcus," she said, climbing down from the wagon despite Samuel's whispered protest. "Let's you and me talk private like. No need to involve anyone else." "Lula, no," Samuel said, but she was already walking toward the outlaw, her hands visible and empty. "Smart girl," Marcus said approvingly. "Always knew you had more sense than your daddy gave you credit for." As she drew closer, Lula could see the changes 5 years had wrought in Marcus Kane. He was thinner now, harder, with the look of a man who'd been living rough. There were new scars on his face and hands, and his clothes were travel-worn and dusty. But his eyes held the same cold intelligence that had always made him dangerous. "Now then," he said conversationally, "let's talk about that gold." "There is no gold, Marcus. If there was, do you think I'd be working fields for room and board? Maybe, if you're smart enough to know that living rich would draw attention. Your daddy always said you were the clever one in the family." Behind her, she heard Samuel dismounting from the wagon, his boots hitting the ground with purpose. Marcus's attention flicked to him, and his hand moved closer to his gun. "That's close enough, farmer. Name's Samuel Garrett, and this is my land. I'd appreciate you stating your business and moving along." Marcus smiled, showing teeth stained brown from tobacco. "My business is with Lula here. But since you seem so attached to her, maybe you can help me convince her to be reasonable. See, I got information that says John Perry hid a considerable sum from the Canyon Creek job. 20,000 in gold coins, plus some jewelry that belonged to a banker's wife. That's a lot of money to just disappear." "My father never told me anything about hidden gold," Lula said, keeping her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "The last time I saw him, he was in jail waiting to hang. We didn't discuss treasure maps. But you visited him, didn't you? Right before the end." Lula's heart skipped. She'd never told anyone about that final visit, about the desperate things her father had whispered through the jail bars. But Marcus seemed to know about it. "How do you?" "I make it my business to know things, darling. Had a friend who worked at that jail, told me all about your tearful goodbye. Said your daddy was real insistent about talking to you alone, real urgent-like." The memory came flooding back despite her efforts to keep it buried. Her father, gaunt and desperate in his cell, grabbing her hands through the bars and whispering frantically about forgiveness and second chances and something hidden where the 3 oaks meet the creek. She'd thought it was delirium, the ravings of a man facing death. She'd walked away without listening, too angry and hurt to care about his final words. But Marcus was watching her face, and she knew he'd seen the recognition there. "There we go," he said softly. "Starting to remember now, aren't you?" "I remember him talking nonsense," Lula said quickly. He was half out of his mind with fear. Was he now? Or was he trying to make sure his little girl would be taken care of after he was gone? Marcus took a step closer, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper. $20,000, Lula. Enough to set you up for life, enough to buy respectability and a fine house and all the pretty dresses your heart desires. Your daddy wanted you to have it. Even if that were true, I don't know where it is. But you could figure it out, couldn't you? Smart girl like you, with all those little clues rattling around in that pretty head. All you need is the right motivation. His eyes flicked meaningfully toward Samuel, and the threat was clear. Cooperate, or the man who'd shown her kindness would pay the price. Leave him out of this, Lula said quietly. That's entirely up to you, darling. Help me find what your daddy hid, and nobody needs to get hurt. Keep playing dumb and, well, accidents happen. Samuel had moved closer during their conversation, and now stood only a few yards away, the rifle held ready but not yet aimed. His presence gave Lula strength, reminded her that she wasn't facing this alone. I'll need time to think, she said. To remember. My father said a lot of things that last day and I wasn't really listening. Marcus smiled, pleased by what he took to be cooperation. See? I knew you were a reasonable girl. Take all the time you need, say until tomorrow night. But Lula, darling, don't even think about running. I got friends watching the roads, and if you try to slip away, your farmer friend here might have an unfortunate accident. He touched the brim of his hat in a mockery of politeness and melted back into the shadows as easily as he'd appeared. A few minutes later, they heard the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance. Samuel waited until the sound was completely gone before lowering his rifle. Who was that? Marcus Kane. One of my father's associates. He's been hunting me for years. And this gold he's talking about? Lula closed her eyes, trying to sort through the tangled memories of that final jail visit. I don't know. Maybe. My father said some things, but I thought he was just... I was so angry with him, Samuel. I didn't want to hear his excuses or his promises. I just wanted it to be over. Samuel holstered his rifle and drew her into his arms, and she let herself lean against his solid warmth. What do you remember? Something about 3 oaks and a creek. But that could describe half the hiding places in Colorado. Even if there really is gold hidden somewhere, I wouldn't know where to start looking. Then we tell him that. We explain that you don't have the information he wants. Lula pulled back to look at him, seeing the earnest hope in his eyes. Sweet Samuel, who believed that reason and honesty could solve any problem. She loved him for that innocence, even as she knew it wouldn't save them. You don't know Marcus Kane, she said softly. He's not the kind of man who accepts no for an answer. If I can't give him what he wants, he'll try to torture it out of me. And if that doesn't work, he'll start hurting people I care about until I remember something useful. Then what do we do? It was the question she'd been dreading, because there was only one answer that would keep Samuel safe. The same answer she'd given herself a dozen times before in a dozen different towns when trouble caught up with her. I have to leave, she said, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. Tonight, before he comes back. If I'm not here, he'll have no reason to hurt you. No. Samuel's voice was firm. We're not running from this, Lula. We're not letting fear make our decisions. This isn't fear, it's sense. Marcus Kane is a killer, Samuel. He's wanted in 3 states for murder, robbery, and worse. The only reason he hasn't killed me already is because he thinks I can lead him to that gold. But once he realizes I really don't know anything, then we go to the law. We tell Deputy Butler what's happening. Butler? Lula almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. Samuel, Butler would probably thank Marcus for solving his problem. He'd love nothing more than to see John Perry's daughter disappear permanently. Not all lawmen are corrupt, Lula. And not all of them would stand by and let a woman be murdered. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust in his faith and human decency. But she'd learned hard lessons about what people would overlook when it came to the children of outlaws. "Maybe not," she said. "But I can't take that chance. Not with your life." Samuel cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. "And I can't take the chance of losing you. Not now, not when we've finally found each other. Samuel. No, listen to me. We'll figure this out together. Maybe there really is gold hidden somewhere, and maybe we can find it and give it to him. Maybe we can convince Butler to help us, or maybe we can get word to the territorial marshal. But we're not going to let a man like Marcus Kane destroy what we've built here." The determination in his voice gave her hope, even as her practical mind cataloged all the ways this could go wrong. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't facing trouble alone. For the first time, someone else was willing to fight for her, to stand beside her against whatever came. "All right," she said finally. "We'll try. But Samuel, if this goes bad, if Marcus decides to make good on his threats." "It won't come to that. But if it does, promise me you won't do anything heroic. Promise me you'll save yourself." Samuel smiled, and in that smile she saw all the love and stubborn protectiveness that had drawn her to him from the beginning. "Can't promise that, Lula. Man's got to protect what's his." His words sent warmth flooding through her, chasing away some of the cold fear that had settled in her bones. She was his and he was hers, and whatever came next they would face it together. They walked back to the house hand in hand, checking each room carefully before settling in the kitchen. Samuel made coffee while Lula tried to piece together the fragments of memory from that final jail visit, searching for any clue that might lead them to the gold Marcus was so desperate to find. Outside, the summer night stretched on, peaceful and warm, but Lula knew it was the calm before the storm. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and perhaps the final test of whether love could truly triumph over the legacy of blood and violence that had shaped her life. But tonight she was home. Tonight she was safe in Samuel's arms. And for now that was enough. Dawn came gray and cold, autumn's first warning that summer's grace was ending. Lula stood at the kitchen window, watching frost glitter on the pumpkin vines, while coffee percolated on the stove behind her. She'd barely slept, her mind turning over fragments of her father's final words, searching for meaning in what she dismissed as a dying man's ravings. "3 oaks meet the creek," she murmured, the phrase that had haunted her dreams. It could mean anything, could be anywhere in the vast Colorado territory. But something about it nagged at her, some half-remembered significance that danced just beyond her grasp. Samuel emerged from the bedroom, already dressed for the day's work. He moved to stand behind her, his hands settling on her shoulders with familiar warmth. "Any luck remembering?" he asked gently. "Pieces. Nothing that makes sense yet." She leaned back against his chest, drawing strength from his steady presence. "Samuel, I've been thinking. Maybe I should go to Marcus voluntarily, tell him I'll help him search. Buy us some time to figure out what to do." "Absolutely not." His voice was firm. "I won't have you putting yourself in that man's hands. But if I don't, he'll come here. He'll hurt you to get to me." Samuel turned her to face him, his eyes serious. "Lula, I need you to understand something. I've been thinking all night too, and I've made my decision. Whatever happens with Marcus Kane, we face it together. I'm not letting you sacrifice yourself to protect me." She wanted to argue, but the determination in his voice told her it would be useless. Samuel Garrett had made up his mind, and she was beginning to understand that beneath his gentle exterior lay a core of steel that wouldn't bend. A sharp knock at the front door interrupted their conversation. They exchanged glances, both thinking the same thing. Marcus had returned early. but the voice that called out was familiar and welcome. "Samuel, it's Jake Morrison. Need to talk to you urgent-like." Samuel opened the door to reveal Jake and his brother Tommy, both looking grim and determined. Behind them stood Henry Blackwood and, to Lula's surprise, Deputy Marshal Butler. "Morning, folks," Butler said, touching his hat brim. "Mind if we come in?" "Course," Samuel replied, though his tone was wary. "Coffee's fresh." The men filed into the kitchen, their expressions serious. Butler accepted a cup of coffee but remained standing, his badge catching the morning light. "Got some troubling news," he began without preamble. "Had a telegram from the Territorial Marshal's office yesterday evening. Seems there's been sightings of Marcus Kane in the area, and they're mighty concerned about what he might be up to." Lula felt her heart sink. If the law was already looking for Marcus, it meant he'd left a trail of violence behind him. What kind of sightings? "Dead man found outside Denver 3 weeks ago. Store owner who'd been asking too many questions about a certain young woman matching your description. Then another body in Colorado Springs, a clerk who'd been checking through old wanted posters." Butler's eyes were grim. "Kane's been tracking you, Miss Perry, and he's been killing anyone who got in his way." The room fell silent. Lula felt sick, knowing that innocent people had died because of her, because Marcus's obsession with her father's gold had driven him to murder. "There's more," Butler continued. "Territorial Marshals offering a $1,000 reward for information leading to Kane's capture. Dead or alive." Henry Blackwood leaned forward on his walking stick. "Frank, what exactly are you telling us?" "I'm telling you that Marcus Kane is a dangerous man who's coming for Miss Perry, and when he gets here, people are going to die unless we're ready for him." Samuel set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "He was here last night." Butler's attention snapped to him. "What?" "Came calling while we were at the church social. Made his intentions clear. He wants information about gold he thinks John Perry hid, and he's willing to hurt innocent people to get it." "Why didn't you send for me immediately?" Samuel's expression hardened slightly. "Because last time you were here, Frank, you seemed more interested in harassing Miss Perry than protecting her. Didn't seem like you'd be much help against a man like Kane." Butler had the grace to look uncomfortable. That's fair, I suppose. But this changes things. Kane's wanted for multiple murders now. Helping catch him would be a service to the territory." "And Miss Perry?" Samuel asked pointedly. "What happens to her in all this?" "She cooperates with our investigation. Tells us everything she knows about where her father might have hidden that gold. We use that information to lure Kane into a trap." "Using her as bait," Samuel said flatly. "Using her as a concerned citizen helping the law." Lula found her voice. "And if I don't know anything useful? If my father really didn't tell me where he hid the gold?" Butler studied her for a long moment. "Then we'll have to hope Kane believes you when you tell him that." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. They all knew Marcus Kane wouldn't simply accept her word and ride away disappointed. "There might be another way," Henry Blackwood said quietly. All eyes turned to the old man, who was staring thoughtfully into his coffee cup. "Lula, you said your father mentioned 3 Oaks and a creek?" "Yes, but..." "There's a place about 10 miles north of here, up in the foothills. 3 ancient oaks growing right at the bend of Miller's Creek. Been there since before the first settlers came through. If a man wanted to hide something in this territory, and he wanted to remember where he put it, that'd be as good a landmark as any." Hope flickered in Lula's chest. "You think that's what he meant?" "Could be. Worth looking anyway. If there really is gold hidden there, finding it might be the only way to get Kane off your trail." Samuel nodded slowly. "Even if we find it, though, we still have to deal with Kane himself. Man like that won't just take the gold and disappear. He's killed too many people to leave witnesses behind. That's where we come in, Jake Morrison said, speaking for the first time since arriving. Been talking to the boys and we're all agreed. Kane wants to make trouble in our valley. He'll find out we don't take kindly to threats against our neighbors. Jake's right, Tommy added. You got friends here, Miss Perry? More than you might think. Butler looked around the room, taking in the determined faces of the local men. Are you talking about forming a posse? We're talking about protecting our community, Henry said firmly. However that needs to happen. The old man's words carried weight, and Lula felt a surge of emotion she couldn't quite name. These men, most of whom barely knew her, were willing to risk their lives to protect her. It was more than she'd ever dared hope for. All right, Butler said finally. Here's what we'll do. Miss Perry and I will ride out to those 3 Oaks, see if there's anything hidden there. Meanwhile, the rest of you spread the word quietly. We're expecting trouble and we need to be ready for it. I'm going with you, Samuel said immediately. Samuel, Lula began, but he cut her off. Non-negotiable. If there's any chance of danger, I'm not letting you face it alone. Butler looked like he might argue, but Henry Blackwood's weathered hand fell on the deputy's shoulder. Frank, you're going to need all the help you can get with Kane. Samuel's a good man in a fight and he knows these hills better than anyone. Let him come. After some discussion, it was decided that they would ride out immediately before Marcus could return with reinforcements. The other men would spread word through the valley, quietly organizing a defense in case Kane decided to make his stand in town. The ride to Miller's Creek took them through country Lula had never seen, steep hills covered with aspen and pine, their leaves just beginning to turn gold with the changing season. Samuel rode beside her, his rifle across his saddle, while Butler took point, his eyes constantly scanning for signs of trouble. The 3 Oaks were exactly as Henry had described them, ancient giants that had stood sentinel over the creek bend for longer than anyone could remember. Their massive trunks were scarred by weather and time, their branches reaching toward the sky like gnarled fingers. If your father hid something here, Butler said, dismounting, where would he put it? Lula studied the landscape, trying to see it through her father's eyes. John Perry had been many things, but he'd been clever about hiding his ill-gotten gains. He would have chosen a spot that was both secure and memorable. There, she said, pointing to where the largest oak's roots disappeared into the creek bank. The roots would protect it from floods, and the trees big enough to serve as a permanent landmark. They spent an hour digging in the soft earth around the oak's base, their shovels ringing against stones and roots. Just when Lula was beginning to think they were wasting their time, Samuel's shovel struck something that wasn't stone or wood. Got something, he called, dropping to his knees to clear away the dirt with his hands. What emerged was a metal strongbox, rusted but intact, wrapped in oiled canvas that had mostly protected it from the elements. Butler lifted it carefully, surprised by its weight. Heavy enough to be gold, he said grimly. The lock had long since rusted away, and the box opened with a screech of protesting metal. Inside, nestled in rotting fabric, were stacks of gold coins and several pieces of jewelry that gleamed despite their years underground. Sweet Lord, Samuel breathed. It's really here. Lula stared at the treasure that had cost so many lives, feeling nothing but disgust. This was what Marcus Kane had killed for, what her father had died for. Gold and jewelry stolen from innocent people, buried in the ground like some pirate's hoard. Reckon there's 20,000 here easy, Butler said, hefting one of the coin sacks. Maybe more. Blood money, Lula said quietly. Every piece of it bought with someone else's pain. Samuel reached over and squeezed her hand. Your father's choices don't define you, Lula. Remember that. Butler was securing the strongbox when they heard the sound of approaching horses. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, and Lula's blood turned to ice as she recognized Marcus Kane in the lead. "Well, well," Marcus called out as he rode closer, his 2 companions flanking him with rifles ready. "Looks like little Lula's been holding out on me after all." "Kane," Butler said, his hand moving to his gun. "You're under arrest for murder." Marcus laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Am I now? Seems to me you're outnumbered, deputy. And besides, I got business to finish with the Perry girl." "The gold's right here," Lula said, stepping forward despite Samuel's protective gesture. "Take it and go. You've got what you came for." "Oh, I'll take it, darling. But I'm afraid I can't leave witnesses behind. You understand." The threat was clear, and Lula saw Butler's hand tighten on his gun. But Marcus's companions already had their rifles aimed, and any move toward violence would likely end with all of them dead. "Marcus," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "these men have nothing to do with this. They're just in the wrong place at the wrong time," Marcus finished. "Story of life, ain't it?" What happened next would be debated in the valley for years to come. Some said it was Samuel who moved first, diving to push Lula behind the cover of the oak tree. Others claimed it was Butler who drew his gun and fired the first shot. But everyone agreed on what came after: the sharp crack of rifle fire echoing off the hills, the whinnying of frightened horses, and the desperate scramble for cover that followed. When the smoke cleared, one of Marcus's men lay motionless on the ground, and Butler was clutching a bleeding shoulder. Marcus himself had taken cover behind a fallen log, the strongbox forgotten in his desperate attempt to avoid the bullets that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "What the hell?" Marcus started to say, then stopped as he saw movement in the trees around them. Jake Morrison stepped into view, his rifle trained on Marcus's position. A moment later, Tommy appeared from another direction, then Henry Blackwood, then half a dozen other men from the valley. They'd followed the sound of gunfire and arrived just in time to turn the tide. "It's over, Kane," Butler called out, his voice strained with pain but steady. "You're surrounded." Marcus looked around wildly, seeing rifle barrels pointing at him from every direction. His remaining companion had already thrown down his weapon and raised his hands. "This ain't possible," Marcus snarled. "You're just farmers and shopkeepers." "We're neighbors," Henry Blackwood said firmly. "And we protect our own." The fight went out of Marcus Kane all at once, his shoulders sagging as he realized his situation was hopeless. He threw his gun aside and slowly raised his hands. "Guess the gold was cursed after all," he said bitterly. As the men of the valley secured the prisoners and tended to Butler's wound, Lula found herself standing beside the open strongbox, staring down at the treasure that had caused so much death and suffering. "What will happen to it?" she asked Samuel. "Butler says it'll have to be returned to whoever it was stolen from, if they can be identified. What's left over goes to the territory." "Good," she said firmly. "I never want to see it again." Samuel wrapped his arms around her, and she leaned into his warmth, finally allowing herself to believe that it was truly over. Marcus Kane was captured, the gold was found, and she was still alive and whole and free. "It's finished," Samuel murmured against her hair. "You're safe now." "We're safe," she corrected, turning in his arms to look up at him. "All of us." As they rode back to the valley, surrounded by the men who'd risked their lives to protect her, Lula felt something she'd never experienced before. The absolute certainty that she belonged somewhere, that she was part of something larger than herself. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, in the same churchyard where Martha Hendricks had tried to drive her away. Most of the valley turned out for the celebration, bringing covered dishes and good wishes and the kind of acceptance Lula had never dared dream of. Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony under an arch of autumn leaves, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp air as he spoke about love and redemption and the grace that could transform even the most broken lives. Do you, Samuel, take Lula to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live? I do, Samuel said, his voice strong and sure. And do you, Lula, take Samuel to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live? Lula looked into Samuel's kind eyes and saw her future reflected there, a future built on love and trust and the daily choice to see the good in each other despite their flaws. I do, she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. When they kissed to seal their vows, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Even Martha Hendricks, who'd softened her stance after witnessing the community's defense of Lula, managed a grudging smile. Later, as the celebration continued around them, Samuel and Lula slipped away to walk through the apple orchard behind their house. The trees were heavy with fruit, and the air was sweet with the scent of harvest. Any regrets? Samuel asked, his arm around her waist. About marrying you? Never. Lula smiled up at him. About everything else? Too many to count. But I'm learning that regret's just another kind of prison if you let it be. And you're done with prisons. I'm done with prisons, she agreed. Ready to build something instead of always running from something. They stood together in the fading light, husband and wife, partners in the truest sense. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new seasons to weather, new tests of their love and commitment. But tonight they were home. Tonight they were free. And in the distance, if you listened carefully, you could hear the sound of laughter and music drifting from the celebration, the sound of a community that had chosen love over fear, acceptance over judgment. It was the sound of redemption made real, of second chances taken and treasured. John Perry's daughter was finally free of her father's shadow, and Lula Garrett was ready to write her own story at last.